In the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution caused an increase in meat-producing factories. With the growth of factories, the quality of meat products dropped drastically. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle in January 1906, bringing the rights to food safety to the attention of American people. President Theodore Roosevelt felt a responsibility to raise the standards of how meat was being produced. Roosevelt and Congress passed the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act in June 1906, giving consumers for the first time the right to know what was in their food. Theodore Roosevelt's calling to reform the meat market after the publishing of The Jungle changed the way Americans thought about food and their rights. The Industrial Revolution began in the mid-1800s. At the start of the revolution, the food industry took a turn for the worse. Food, which had always been grown and prepared at home, was now beginning to be processed in factories. This shift caused the quality and safety of food, especially in meat, to decline. Large meat factories started to prioritize profits over people. This mindset led them to make unsafe decisions that sickened and killed countless people, including numerous soldiers in the embalmed beef scandal of 1898. Beef that was being sent to soldiers fighting in the Spanish-American War was said to be defective and have an odor like an embalmed dead body. Theodore Roosevelt, who had fought in the Spanish-American War before becoming U.S. president, was forced to eat some of the embalmed beef and believed it to be tainted. This scandal sparked the interest of many people into the safety of America's meat. One of the most well-known of these people was Upton Sinclair. Sinclair was a journalist living in Chicago who pushed to change the food industry. Sinclair had published many works, but none had sold well. Fred Warren, the editor of the Socialist Journal, Appeal to Reason, asked Sinclair to write a novel about immigrant workers in Chicago meatpacking houses. Sinclair eagerly accepted. For 7 weeks, he prowled the streets of packing plants. He would slip into plants dressed as an employee to gain first-hand knowledge of the work. Sinclair knew his story would be criticized. Therefore, he was cautious and only published proven facts. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark in these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of the dry dung of rats. When Sinclair eventually tried to publish his novel, 6 publishers rejected him. He was told by a consultant from one of the publishers, "One feels that what is at the bottom of his fierceness is not nearly so much desire to help the poor, but his hatred of the rich." Eventually, in January 1906, Doubleday Paging Company published his book. The Jungle was an instant hit, selling over 25,000 copies in only 6 weeks. The Jungle brought the horrors of the Chicago meat industry to life, and it wouldn't be long until the public learned about the heaps of chemicals and piles of rat droppings that found their way into Chicago's meat and into the mouths of the populace. The Jungle brought the public's attention to the consequences of a completely free market. Sinclair sent President Theodore Roosevelt a copy of The Jungle to inform him of the poor conditions in America's meat factories. Roosevelt was already interested in advocating the safety of America's meat after his first-hand experiences in the embalmed beef scandal. When Theodore Roosevelt was elected for a second term on November 8, 1904, he had promised to reform industry and fix the current failing factory system. Despite this, Roosevelt was skeptical of Sinclair and all the journalists advocating to reform industry, calling them muckrakers. Now it is very necessary that we should not flinch from seeing what is vile and debasing. There is filth on the floor, and it must be scraped up with the muck rake. And there are times and places where this service is the most needed of all the services that can be performed. But the man who never does anything else, who never thinks, or speaks, or writes, saves of his feet with the muck rake, speedily becomes, not a help, but one of the most potent forces for evil. Roosevelt had made attempts to pass bills and acts to fix the industrial system, but none ever got far. Part of the reason none of these bills were passed was that the public didn't have an interest in industry and didn't think there was a problem.
There's a lot of debate in Congress about whether the federal government had the right to regulate food, because that was something that had been regulated locally. And what's special about Theodore Roosevelt is he really argued that the federal government had to regulate these things, that this had to be national.
After reading The Jungle, Roosevelt was still unsure whether all the facts that Sinclair claimed were true. In an attempt to discover the legitimacy of The Jungle, Roosevelt sent Labor Commissioner Charles P. Neal and social worker James Brawson Reynolds to investigate the meat industry. In investigating, they found that all of the statements Sinclair made were true, and wrote the Neal-Reynolds Report, exposing again the horrors of Chicago meatpacking houses. Piles of sausages and dry, moldy canned meats, admittedly several years old, were found, which the superintendent stated to us will be tanked and converted into grease. The Neal-Reynolds Report describes the conditions of the Chicago packing houses as revolting. This was the last straw for Roosevelt. He realized that food safety was something that needed to be regulated nationally. Large industries did not like the idea of reform. He was told by an informant from Armour and Company, "He will have to be well disguised, for the lid is on in Packingtown. He will find 2 detectives in places where before there was only 1. Despite this, Roosevelt continued to push for reform. With the support of the public and his own research, Roosevelt was finally able to write the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. These acts were written to protect consumers from industries who only care about profits and not about the safety of American citizens. These acts created turmoil in Congress because individuals were still unsure whether food protection needed to be regulated nationally, since it had always been regulated locally. Eventually, in June 1906, the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act were passed. Until this point, little had been done to protect the public's right to eat safe food. These acts provided basic levels of protection that consumers had never known before this time. For the first time, food companies were held accountable for the food that they sold. These companies were forced to clean up their facilities, display their nutritional information honestly, and safely dispose of diseased and spoiled meats. At first, the meat industry was worried that these reforms could hurt their profits, but they soon realized that acceptance would be necessary to restore the public's faith in the food industry.
And also, they had been facing like 50 different state regulations, and so one set of regulations that trumped those state laws was easier for them. So they might have preferred no regulation at all, but in the context that they were operating in, the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which was what was eventually passed, was something that they thought was a good idea, and that it would restore people's confidence in large processed meat companies.
These acts would also help pave the way for other food rights advocates, such as Harvey Washington Wiley, the creator of the Bureau of Chemistry that eventually became the Food and Drug Administration. The FDA continues to protect the public from dangerous food products. These reforms helped lead the way towards reforms in other industries, such as drug and healthcare products. Of all the laws passed during the Progressive Era, no legislation proved more successful and more enduring than the 1906 Food and Drug legislation. These acts established the foundations of modern American food and drug law, and for the first time the federal government assumed permanent and comprehensive responsibility for the health and safety of the American food and drug supply. Without the efforts of people like Sinclair and Theodore Roosevelt, these reforms would have been greatly delayed, or never happened. Roosevelt forever changed the rights of American people. He gave consumers the right to eat safe food, and the government the responsibility to regulate the food supply. Although industries still try to cut corners in the safety and quality of their food products, because of the jungle and the reforms that it sparked, consumers can now buy their family dinner with some certainty that what they are eating is safe.